creating inadequate access to health care and education and healthy foods. So the program really is about jobs. It's intended to create jobs to lift up a community, as well as create a wage base such that a community can start to prosper.
One of the questions I often get is, what is the thing I have to build? People used to, I've got to build a residential rental project, or I've got to rehab a historic building. Some the other type incentives are out there, and I usually try to say this is more focused on the place rather than the thing. But you all might comment, well, maybe that's a topic for later. But just mention that at this jumping off point that this isn't quite as thing-oriented as it is place-oriented. At least that's the way I think of it.
Yeah, well, there's no doubt. I mean, it is all about where you're located, and we'll talk a little bit about the qualifications and specifically what qualifies you. But then we're going to broaden that and talk about more about. You can't just qualify. There's a lot more to that. But step one really is where you're located, and that's because the intent of the program is to build up low-income communities to help them be more self-sustaining. So just some of the overall benefits. This is pretty much data-driven. Between 2006 and 2016, the government has provided NMTC allocations to more than 350 community development entities. So we're trying to keep everybody understanding who's up here. Khalil is with the community development entity, and that's and as well as they do some lending. And Chris is well with SunTrust has a community development entity, and they also act as an investor. So trying to give you a little bit of sense of the hats that are being worn by some of the folks up here. The total allocation to date is $50.5 billion. We most recently in November had what we call a super round or a double round that was $7 billion, which was actually the 2015 and 2016 rounds that they delayed in order to catch up because they had been running behind. But the catch-up part was that it was a double round. Since 2003, the program has created or retained about 200,000 jobs, supported construction for 32 million square feet of manufacturing, 75 million square feet of office space, and over 50 million square feet of retail space. So again, we'll talk a little bit more about asset classes, and you see it. That's a very high-level asset class right there. In those details. For every dollar invested by the federal government, it is estimated that an additional $8 of private investment is generated, making it one of the most efficient programs and uses of tax dollars. And according to a study all the way back in 2007, 88% of investors had said they would not have considered investing into a project without the credits. So I'm going to turn the next slide over to Chris to talk a little bit about current developments and some of the timing in the industry that we're experiencing.
Sure. So as Dick just mentioned, we had a double round that was recently awarded in November of 2016. So $7 billion of New Markets Allocation Authority has kind of hit the streets and is in the process of finding a home with deals in low-income communities or projects in low-income communities right now. So most of us up here right now, actually probably all of us up here right now, are all very busy finding where and working on which projects we want to close with the different hats that we all wear. In that round, there were 238 applications requesting $17.6 billion of allocation. So that gives you an idea of kind of how hungry the market is for New Markets Allocation. We're always oversubscribed. It's a very competitive process. So winning an award is something that we all kind of take very seriously and take to heart in the same way that we take it very seriously in the way that we deploy our allocations. So the allocation sizes ranged from $15 to $90 million. Average was $58.3 million, and there were 120 awardees of those 238 applicants. That because it was a double round, that number of awardees was up from typically an average of around 90 to 95 in the more typical $3.5 billion round. And actually, the government, in order to try to continue catching up, is going to be releasing the 2017 Notice of Allocation Authority, or NOAA, here in probably the next few weeks. We're hearing anywhere from late March to early April at this point. There'll be a 60-day window in which we all have to complete the application. It's a very labor-intensive process. So that'll be due in, early summer. And then we hope those awards will be made, or expect those awards to be made probably in the fourth quarter of this year. So, not only are we closing deals today, we're also looking for 2018 pipeline, and beyond, frankly, because the program does have, a couple more years of authority associated with it currently.
Chris, that last point you mentioned was from somebody in the audience beforehand about we've got a new administration here that's threatening to take away a lot of current tax programs. So
right.
Funded out through, 2000?
Yeah, we have 3 rounds of allocation left, I believe. So we have 3 years that, have been passed into law. And, obviously with tax reform looming, we don't know exactly what that means for the program because, again, this is not a permanent program. And frankly, with tax reform, I don't know that anything's really considered permanent. So we'll all have to just stay tuned for that and continue our advocacy with our local congressmen and congresswomen to make sure they understand the benefit of new markets to their communities.
Yeah, and to be clear, that there was a 5-year extension that covers tell me if I'm wrong about this, 15, 16, 17, 18, and 19.
Yeah. Right.
And 15 and 16 were just awarded in November, and we're just starting to close deals. There was, I believe, about $1 billion of allocation left over from prior rounds at that time or at the end of this year. So we're probably still looking at, I don't know that we probably closed $1 billion. We're probably still looking at another $17.5 billion that's either authorized or available at this point. So, and then it takes a couple of years. So we've got a few years left at the very least.
Right.
So at this point, I kind of look at that as historically we were on 2-year extensions, and we were always more so on pins and needles about, December 30th passing legislation and the extenders, et cetera, and whether we're going to have a program.
I think we got a question.
Do the awardees have a certain time frame where they have to spend the money?
That's a great question, and yes. So legally, we have 5 years to deploy that capital. In reality, 2 years is really what we are held to the standard with the government, and that's important for us if we want to continue in this program, winning awards, to kind of stay on that track. So every group has a slightly different strategy for how they deploy dollars. Some want to get it out as quickly as possible. We tend to deploy ours on a rolling basis. So, we won $80 million in the last round. We'll probably be deploying that through, decent chunk of 2018, to be perfectly frank. We don't try to, just throw it out at the first deal that walks in the door.
So, the first question to zero there, it sounds like you already have more applications than you can fund. Are you still taking applications, or am I not thinking of numbers correctly?
So those go ahead, Dick. If you
try to clarify. So the this is the application, the last application. When he referred to as the NOAA, this is the last application. He was giving you some of the data. There were 238 applicants that requested $17.6 billion of allocation, of which there was only $7 billion available. So $7 billion got awarded to 120 of those 238, and 118 didn't get anything, which is actually, the percentage-wise, over 50% being successful is actually pretty high because it was a double round. I don't think there was double the applicants, and I don't think there was double the requested allocation. So typically it's lower than 50%, and whatever 7 divided by 17 is, it's usually lower than that percentage as well in terms of what was asked for in the typical $3.5 billion that's actually awarded.
Just keep me straight there. This is CDEs applying to the federal government for it. This is not non-projects or
right.
the public.
Right. So that's right. That's right. So that's the next piece, is that they're applying to CFI fund for this allocation, and you turn around and now you have $7 billion. Now, what's the appetite for people that want to do transactions? I mean, it's probably $50 billion to that set.
Yeah, we're extremely over. I mean, I'll be interested to hear kind of how you're oversubscribed, but we have typically in our pipeline, we want $80 million in allocation. We have a pipeline that usually adds up to $500 million or more at any point in time of eligible projects that are in different stages of readiness. So, I mean, it's an extremely competitive process. We probably fund 10% of the deals that we wind up looking at or less.
I would say that's the same for us. We had a pipeline going into this round of about $500 million. But I found it interesting with this particular round. So, you have a $500 million pipeline, right? But then there are only, a certain amount of projects that a CDE might feel is really new markets worthy. And I was expecting, with so much allocation on the street, that it would be difficult to really identify as many projects as I'm seeing this year that are really new markets worthy. I mean, there's some really great projects out there. So it seems like this amount of allocation met, you could say coincidentally or by fate, a lot of very worthy projects that can be funded that wouldn't have otherwise been funded in a previous round if you didn't have so much allocation on the street. So with that said, if you're looking for new markets allocation, it's really just a matter of contacting CDEs to see where they are in their pipeline, because certainly we've not every CDE has allocated their entire award out for 2017. Like Chris said, a lot of it for a lot of us will probably be on a rolling basis into 2018.
And we'll get into a lot more detail of exactly the process that, a project sponsor like yourselves will go through in order to find new markets later in the panel.
I think that's a great segue. I'm going to turn it back over to you two guys. We talk about examples of projects, and you can see it up there, and it's a pretty wide range. I think CDE should be known. The different CDEs have different types of asset classes that they're interested in. So, Khalil and Chris, why don't you guys talk about what you see? And Chris, as an investor, you probably cover a lot of asset classes.
Sure. So like Dick mentioned earlier, I wear a couple different hats at SunTrust. One is that of a CDE or an applicant to this program where we win our own allocation and deploy it. And then the other is that of an investor in non-bank new markets allocations. And we'll go through a flow chart so you understand that. But let's set the investor hat off to the side for a minute, and I'll just talk a minute about what we like to do with our new markets allocation. Really, as you can see on this list, there's a lot of different asset classes you can finance with new markets. We tend to like to focus on really kind of three broad types of projects. Projects, and this is in no particular order, but projects that create quality jobs, meaning that they pay a living wage and they provide reasonable benefits to their employees, such as health care, retirement, et cetera. We really focus on full-time jobs as a part of that. Secondly, we like projects that have an education focus. That's obviously a huge issue in many of our communities that SunTrust serves, which really ranges from Maryland all the way south to Miami, Florida, and west to Memphis, Tennessee. So we look at a lot of deals that have an education focus to them. And then lastly, we focus on projects that contribute to wellness. And wellness is a broad category, and we strategically chose that term because we see a need for healthcare-oriented facilities such as FQHCs, emergency care facilities, rural healthcare hospitals, and emergency care across our footprint, as well as the projects that are more focused on preventive wellness, such as YMCAs and other sort of health centers of that nature. So those are the kind of the big three asset classes that we look for when we're deploying our allocation.
And it's like we work for the same organization. I would have to echo that. Right. With regards to jobs, we are looking for projects that create not just a significant number of jobs, but quality jobs. So we're looking for jobs, as Chris said, that pay a living wage rate, that offer their employees full-time benefits, that perhaps have a job training component or program that can move a person from an entry-level position through a career path into management. Also looking at projects that if they don't necessarily create paying jobs at the site, again, a project that has a job training feature where you can take low-income residents in the community or residents returning from prison, that prison population, get them trained and put them back out in the community working. So that's a huge feature for us in terms of wellness. We focus on federally qualified health centers, YMCAs. We kind of also put supermarkets, fresh food grocers in that category, looking to finance projects that increase access to fresh foods in communities. And education is key for us and key for me in particular, because I feel like if you're really going to turn a community around in a group of, kind of break that generational poverty, it starts with education. So we financed a good number of charter schools who in charter schools are in need of financing primarily because facilities are very hard to come by for that market. And so New Markets has been a great way to help charter schools obtain affordable facilities. And also, I find myself focusing on early childhood centers a little more, because I feel like the earlier you can get a group of, get to them, the better and the more favorable the outcome is over the long run.
Just out of curiosity, by a raise of hands, how many folks in the room have participated in any way in a New Market transaction in the past? So that's quite a few. Okay. So one of the things, Walter and Tamara, that we do as a firm every couple of weeks on whatever call we call a New Market tax credit call is we try to track and understand what asset classes and what types of deals people are looking at. You've got some stuff coming in your pipeline. Are you seeing anything different than you have in the past, or is there any particular concentration, the type of deal?
I would say the answer to that's driven by what we just heard from Khalil and Chris, and that we work a lot with two CDEs, each of which have their own target missions. The one we work with probably the most has sort of a healthcare purpose to it. So we are seeing typically something from the health sphere coming to us, often a clinic in a rural community, small city or something, or sometimes it's the big downtown old distressed area that the hospital needs some funding. So we're seeing that. We also, the other agency we work with has housing as its purpose. So I think it's trying to find things that tag into the housing world, but it's the ironic fact that you really can't do housing per se. So they're typically doing mixed-use projects, and they have a housing purpose they can further along the process. So what we see is, again, driven by what we just heard, the fact that many CDs have a purpose that they're trying to fulfill in their own right.
I think a point is, which you can talk about, is that in the application for the New Market tax credits for your next time when you're trying to get more, you also have to talk about the projects that you've fulfilled. I think there's this sort of passion from the CDEs about certain projects, and that sort of floats off the page on the applications, which when they ask for new credits, would hopefully the CDFI fund, which we'll talk about what that is exactly, would give more credit. So I think there's sort of a CDE passion about a purpose that we see, and as the New Market tax credits has been going on, they've sort of fine-tuned their passion and are looking for projects that they're excited about that they think would help fulfill their mission.
Yeah, and I think we're definitely seeing a lot of charter schools for the education, and of course we work with Khalil a good bit, so that's part of that. I'm seeing bigger transactions. It's probably tied to the $7 billion, but we're seeing some not only larger transactions that is because there are more CEs involved, but also some folks are putting in more allocation, possibly because they have a bigger allocation to deploy. I also see, and there are reasons for it, referrals, et cetera, but a lot of rural manufacturing transactions, and they tend to be big transactions. You guys seeing Chris in particular, are you seeing anything different this year in terms of size and
Yeah, I think one positive development in our industry, and those of you who have closed New Markets deals are certainly familiar with it, there's a lot of cost to these transactions. And so I think one positive outcome of a $7 billion award is that a lot of CDEs are making the decision to not spread their dollars out quite as much as they might have in the past because they've got more money, they've got more to deploy, so there's more deals getting done with just one CDE and one investor. And those deals are much more efficient to close for everyone involved. And that's a positive thing for the industry because that's been something that has been under focus of, just how efficient is the new markets program. Well, if you've ever done a deal, they're tough compared to conventional financing. But, it kind of, to a certain extent, is what it is because we have to live within the way the regulations are written. But the fewer parties we have at the table in a particular transaction in general is going to be better for everyone. So I do see a trend of allocation for a specific deal going up. But beyond that, we actually are seeing deals getting done that are just $5 million in allocation size, as well as deals that are, in the 20s and 30 million of allocation.
Have you done deals where you bundle different projects within the same organization?
We have. It's not something we do overly frequently, but yes, we've done those with certain nonprofits that have scattered site locations. It is possible.
And we'll talk a little bit about some of the tests you have to meet that makes that a little more challenging, but nonetheless very possible. Okay, so I think we're going to shift, make sure I do it right this time. A little bit of process overview. So we're going to talk about the process and then some of the players in the deal and give you some graphics that you can hopefully wrap your head around. We'll do this quickly. Essentially, the first step these guys have done is, Chris, you guys are a community development entity, correct?
Correct.
And Khalil, you're a CDFI, is that correct? Or?
Both.
Okay. You're both. Okay. So you have to apply to get that certification. I've never been a part of it. I don't know if you guys are part of that process. I don't think it's
that's
particularly difficult. Yeah, that's the easy part. Once you get that certification, then the very next step is this NOAA will come out. We're thinking in this month, so in the next couple of weeks. So you need to apply to the CDFI fund. So a CDE or a CDFI has to apply for the credits. We talked about that earlier, to the CDFI fund in order to receive an allocation. The next step is the CDFI fund will allocate those credits. So that's the $7 billion we were talking about earlier. That was allocated to community development entities and CDFIs by the CDFI fund. The step 4 is the CDEs use these allocations to close transactions. So those of you that have closed transactions, that's that piece of it. And then the last step is it's actually part of really before 4A and 4B is that there's a QEI made and then there's the loan itself, which is a qualification. So that's just a little bit of the background of how you get from I'm interested in the program from a CDE standpoint to actually closing a transaction. But go ahead.
One comment on this. This comes sort of from the folks up here's perspective. I think your perspective, and we get into this as legal counsel, is a totally different perspective. Because if I'm in your shoes as a nonprofit, really your first question is, if I do this project and I'm headed down this path to do all these things that involve leverage lenders and maybe setting up other entities that are needed in the structure, just the first topic is before you want to go to your board and be presenting this is this within my exempt purposes to actually do all these things? I'm a tax-exempt 501 something organization that has defined my role in the world as an entity relative to certain exempt purposes with the IRS. And before you go off and get involved in some mixed-use project that's got all sorts of pieces to it that may deviate from your core mission and become a key element in financing it, just asking of yourself, your internal counsel or external counsel, am I within the realm of my exempt purposes or am I pushing the boundaries and need to think about, is it safe to do that? Because again, you're going to ultimately go to your board and be selling it to them and needing to be comfortable that you are where you are in terms of the goals of your organization. So just side commentary on the legal perspective.
Yeah.
Can you use it to get around that issue or address that issue?
Yeah, I mean, now you're headed down the legal path. Is it such a big thing that it's substantially affecting your exempt purpose? Does it just fall over to our UBIT topic that comes on your 990T? Is it something you're going to isolate in a taxable subsidiary or entity that segregates it? So yes, it's not an all or nothing decision, but it's knowing where you are on that spectrum so you can be identifying how to manage it. That's a good way to put it, yes.
And so just to that point, it might not be a bad idea when you are considering it, right, to contact an attorney to have that conversation because they help you think through, the best structure and if it works for you before you even move forward with the process.
We always figured it out after the fact.
That's probably what happens more often than not.
It does. That's why I made that suggestion.
All right. So this is where we're going to talk about some of the players in the deal, and this is the part where I would suggest that we're going to hopefully wrap your head around a little bit of the structure. I'm going to flip back and forth real quick. I'm going to actually allow Tamara and Walter to talk a little bit about this, but you've got all these players. Oh, that's a timed slide. Okay, we'll come back to that. I can do this. You have all the players, and then they all come into this diagram. So we're gonna piece these two together, and maybe when we get here, if you want to talk a little bit more about qualifications as well, you can do that. Do you guys want to go through just sort of who the players are?
Sure. Why don't you go and go to the picture and
okay.
Mary, you jump in some. This is the secret. This is your secret entree into the world of new market tax credits. If you're a doctor or a lawyer or whatever profession you've got these secret words, and they're how you come to define yourself with the vocabulary that is way of talking, the jargon or whatever. And this is it, because if you walk away from here, the words to know, are qualifications, CDE, Equality, QEI, CDFI fund. Yep, sorry, got to get these back up here. So, if I were looking at this diagram for you all, I would start at the bottom. The QualiB, the acronym down at the bottom, I would think of that as it's labeled as the borrower. That's typically where you're going to fit into this as a nonprofit, as the qualified, active, low-income community business, the acronym. And so that's the party that is ultimately getting the benefit out of this program. We've spent a while off at the left side of the diagram with the gentleman at the far end representing community development entities. And they're probably the most distant from you all perhaps in this, because they're the ones that have gotten the entitlement from the federal government to the credits, and who, as a nonprofit, you're typically trying to link up with to get from a CDE the right to make use of some of the CDE's credit. Now, the CDE that's got the right to the credit isn't the party that actually is going to get the benefit of the credit. You've got somebody who's got income tax that they want to shield with the credit, and that's the party up at the upper right of the diagram, the tax credit investor, that's actually going to come into the deal and put money into the deal and walk away with the credit having been provided by the CDE, the money being put in, which is really the sort of equity coming into the deal that's ultimately going to benefit you, is from that tax credit investor using the jargon you'll get used to here, buying the credits or funding the credits. But somehow they're putting the money in.
Syndicating.
Syndicating, yes. Thank you. And please jump in, people, if I go wrong here, or we get better words for
the credits, yes.
Syndicating credits, yes.
And as a tax credit investor, it's usually a bank or something, right? It's not usually individuals coming in. I'm getting it.
Yeah, and that's where I was referencing. I kind of wear two hats for SunTrust. I work for a subsidiary of the bank called SunTrust Community Capital that specifically invests in various community development tax credits that are out there, including new markets and the low-income housing tax credit, as well as some historic tax credits deals here and there. So we're often in this diagram, the tax credit investor and the CDE. So those are kind of the two hats and lenses that I look at transactions through.
So I think said a different way, just to make it a little more graphic, in a traditional transaction, I, as a CDE, would know that Maria, as a borrower, is looking to finance a project. So I have credits. Chris knows I have credits. Chris says, hey, Khalil, I want to buy your credits. I say, okay. I sell credits to Chris. I take his money, and I put it into Maria's deal as a lender.
So, all right, that's just jumping on. It's real
simple, right?
He puts the money into the deal. So you've got two parties putting money into the deal in your typical structure, the two up at the top. The tax credit investor who actually is putting in money sufficient to get the rights to take a credit on their tax return. Then you've got a second party, the lender over there, who's just coming in to provide money, a loan typically. And the mechanism used to pull it all together and get the money down to you is this piece at the middle there, top middle, the New Market Tax Credit Investment Fund, LLC. And you'll see that sort of structure. This is sort of the basic structure. Later you'll see how these things get bigger and more complicated, but this is our basic structure where those two bring their money together in a single entity that is the New Market Tax Credit Investment, LLC. And here we go to one more of our acronyms. The QEI is the movement of the money that has come in from the tax credit investor and the lender through this combined investment entity gets moved by a qualified equity investment, which is the piece right there in the middle where the $10 million of equity gets contributed into an affiliate of the CDE. Virtually always the CDE does not directly participate, but has a subsidiary of itself right there in the lower middle part of the diagram, the sub-CDE being the active party in a particular transaction through which the qualified equity investment is the dropping down of the money into the sub-CDE, and that's where the credits come and meet up with funding from the two parties, is in that middle diagram. And then you can see the CDE is getting some fees out of the deal. That's why they're in here, is they're getting some fees for doing this whole process. And then here's really the key piece where the money hits the borrower, the qualic B, is the next two pieces, and we'll get to why there are two pieces here, but it's virtually always two loans, two low-interest loans, an A loan as they're labeled and a B loan, that move the money on down in the structure from the sub-CDE to the qualic B. Let me see if I missed any of our magic acronyms along the way. Oh, that piece there gets the acronym QLICI, Qualified Low Income Community Investment. Yes, thank you.
I think also another piece of this is in the deal, which is important, is you can see there's an investor and a lender. So those two amounts come together, and that's your $10 million. The credit is off of that $10 million. So that actually is going to flow to the investor. So you see that $3.9 million of credit, but it's taking advantage of both the lender and the investor's equity and the lender's debt service to create a larger amount in the investment fund so that the credit would be a larger amount. And so,
can the lender and the CDE be the same party or related, or are they opposite?
So they definitely can be. So a typical structure for SunTrust is where we're the investor and one of my partners, of which there are a number in the room here, in our commercial not-for-profit lending space, they're providing that loan in that upper left-hand corner. And then we may or may not, depending on, who's providing allocation to the deal, we may or may not have our own CDE involved in the transaction. That's a different analysis. But yes.
And a follow-up is in that example, is the ratio between lender and tax credit investor essentially 2-to-1 significant, or that's just the example?
This is exhibiting current market prices. So it's a 39% tax credit, hence in this $10 million example, $3.9 million in credits are delivered to the investor over a 7-year period, almost pro rata, not exactly. And so this shows, I believe, $3.3 million is about 86 cents. Is that correct? In terms of the discount that investors are currently paying for the credits, since we don't receive them all up front. And so the other side of that $10 million, the difference between $10 million and $3.3 million is what has to be sourced by a project in terms of debt. And that debt can come from not only a conventional bank or CDFI, such as SunTrust or City First, but also from, a nonprofit's efforts through running a successful capital campaign. You can leverage your own dollars through the transaction in order to minimize the amount of capital you actually have to borrow from a financial institution.
But right, you have to pay the borrower, the nonprofit has to pay the interest during this 7-year period, right? On both loans.
Correct. And then we basically right-size that interest to where it, in the new market structure, you're, servicing just the amount of interest that's due on kind of the true debt, the real debt from the financial institution that may or may not be on this chart. It may actually be sort of a box above this chart here. But we can walk through those details later.
Yeah, I'm going to just go back to one set of details you hit, the simplest level there, Chris, and that's the very rough math you mentioned. We had a $10 million deal. The credits are 39%. So that's 3.9 that the investor is essentially putting in, 3.9 million just to get the credits. They're paying some lesser percentage. It takes into account that it's 7 years. They've got to earn something on in addition to the time. And you're saying that's roughly 86 cents perhaps at a given point in time. It might be 82 cents in a different year.
Right. Prices vary based on the market, the year. There's a lot of factors that drive that.
But that's taking the credit down to what's actually going to get to the borrower at the bottom of the chain. Is that sort of how much goes in the top is 10 million, a 39% credit, a price paid, and then there's more we'll get to. But that's sort of the two big numbers of this.
Right. But the takeaway for those of you who are potential borrowers in the room is that B loan there at the bottom of this structure that shows $3.015 million, that's your benefit. Fees get stripped away from that, professional fees that it takes to structure these deals and close them, eat away a little bit at that. So what we practically tell people to expect is that on a $10 million new markets allocation, you should expect roughly $2.3 to $2.5 million in net benefit. So at the end of the day, that's kind of the gap that new markets can close. So it's not, it's a shallow tax credit, frankly, compared to other tax credits that are in the industry, and that's because it's trying to close a gap in order to incentivize new development in low-income communities. It's not trying to just be the end-all, be-all solution. It obviously takes a lot of different parties to make these deals work.
And just to summarize the math, you start, it's a 39% tax credit. You get 39%, you pay roughly 86 cents on that. It gets us to the 33%, or roughly a third, on a $10 million deal. And there's some upfront fees, and there's some ongoing fees, and there's some closing costs to pay this side of the panel. And so it goes from 39 to 33 to, your point, 23 to 25% net in today's pricing, which is at an all-time high, by the way.
Right.
Dick, are you on this side of the panel?
I was saying this side.
It's technically sold to an affiliate of the Qualic B, typically, for a minimal amount of capital, typically $1,000 or so. And then so that affiliate of the borrower, so maybe the nonprofit's parent in the typical example, would be acquiring that loan for $1,000 and then would be able to do whatever they wanted with it, which most often is to forgive it to itself. So, and obviously if you're a for-profit business, you will have cancellation of debt tax to consider. But since I think most everyone in here we're talking to is a nonprofit, you likely would not have to worry about that additional expense at the end of the transaction.
One quick follow-up, Chris, you both said that you both have quite a backlog in terms of projects entities would like to do. Is there just as much a backlog for the lenders and tax credit investors? I mean, there's plenty of folks that will fill those roles just as easily as if you had the money.
I would say from an investor standpoint, the investor's appetite is sufficient to probably cover the market.
Yes, I agree.
But certainly lenders, there are very few lenders that participate in this space. That lender box, when a lender is participating in a new market tax credit structure, there are certain things from an underwriting perspective that it takes some very savvy lenders to kind of get, not necessarily savvy lenders, but open-minded lenders to get used to. And so one of those things is what's called a standstill provision. So within the 7-year compliance period, we want to make sure that SunTrust gets their credits. So if this deal, if the borrower's project should happen to fail, there's a standstill provision that does not allow that lender to foreclose on that project until the tax credit period has expired. And so lenders have a lot of lenders just don't like that. That's just very counterintuitive. I think that there may be, in this region, I can only think of maybe 3 or 4 traditional banking institutions participating in that market. You'll find CDFIs a little more willing to participate in that space.
City First does, right?
Right, City First does. On our transactions, we're just now getting to the point where we might do it on another CDE transaction. And certainly with nonprofits, you all have the benefit of being able to raise grant funds and things like that. So many nonprofit projects will create a special purpose entity to kind of serve in that lender space and use your grant proceeds as that leverage source of funding.
The one thing I would add, Khalil's comments, if you look at the structure, one of the things that makes third-party lenders who are not regularly in the industry nervous is, if you look, they make the loan to the investment fund, that's a real loan. Mm-hmm. The problem is that loan then, as Walter indicated, becomes an equity investment. So the lender cannot have direct recourse to the underlying business assets. That's why third-party lenders get a little nervous. It takes a fair amount of education, which doesn't limit the lenders that are available.
Yeah, that's something that SunTrust is, we've worked on and got down mostly to a science at this point, exactly how all this works. And it works a lot easier when the same institution is your lender and your investor, because our interests are more aligned as an overall organization to make sure that if the project does get in trouble, we see a clear way out. You don't have two institutions that are at odds with one another, in other words. So it certainly behooves you to be working with, if your deal does need traditional debt, the same institution on both sides. But to answer your question, the hard part, in a real simple place, the two hardest pieces to find in a new markets deal are the allocation, the CDE box, and the debt. If you find those two pieces, the investor is going to come together naturally, because, like Khalil said, there's plenty of us out there. But the other two pieces are the trick. And then once you have those three pieces, then your deal is kind of more ready to go, and that's a marketable transaction.
Okay, so I really do think this is probably our most important slide because it does help you, give you a visual. I'm going to do this really quick. I'm going to just do a summary of it to hopefully ingrain it into your minds so you'll know it forever. CDFI fund awards allocation authority to the CDE in the left. Those are not dollars. It's authority. So Khalil, Chris, they get $70-80 million of authority. Allocation authority. The CDE places that, sub-allocates that, or awards that to an actual project. So the CDE to the sub-CDE and transfers some piece of that authority. There's no dollars going in that scenario either. Then you start the actual dollars. What you need to do is capitalize the investment fund. There's two pieces to it. The tax credit investor is 1/3. The lender is 2/3. That lender could be Mary Center, your own actual, if you did a capital campaign fund or something along those lines, or an actual third-party lender, which Chris just talked a little bit about. You bring that 1/3 and the 2/3 together, you capitalize your investment fund. You make a qualified equity investment into the sub-CDE of the total, which is $10 million, and then they turn around and make a loan to the nonprofit. You can also do equity, but that really wouldn't fit with this audience. So hopefully that helped a little bit just to bring it all back together. Sure.
So, have you seen a structure where you've got a direct lender, say, City First or SunTrust, they're sending directly to the fund, but then also have a nonprofit entity put the funds down into the fund, or more of a structure where you've got the nonprofit entity, and then everything kind of flows through their space for the investment.
That's what we see more of today. So this box is a little simplified. We'll show you a real real structure. Yeah, here's a real structure, which is obviously very hard to read. But to your point, Co, you're exactly right. The way most deals are structured today is City First or SunTrust would lend to a nonprofit, like possibly the parent organization or some affiliate first, and then that entity would basically aggregate the loan from the bank and the capital that they've raised and then lend directly into that investment fund. That's a much cleaner way to do things, frankly, from a lot of different perspectives today.
And also, I think one of the reasons that is a little more favorable to lenders is, as we discussed a little earlier, when a lender is lending directly to that investment fund, you don't have direct collateral on the property, and you're subject to that 7-year standstill agreement. If I make a loan to a nonprofit who then serves as a leverage lender, if that nonprofit has sufficient assets, I can take certain collateral of that nonprofit entity and actually, in some instances, even have my debt amortized as opposed to having to wait for 7 years of interest-only payments or having to, go through 7-year interest-only payments.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of it's a couple of advantages to the lender itself that makes that structure a little more attractive, a lot more attractive.
Yeah, and to the borrower, you're not necessarily having to deal with being stuck in a loan for 7 years. That loan, if it's outside the new market structure, if it's just a bridge for pledges, you can do that over 3 years, and that loan can pay off, and then, the organization's saving money. You're not having to continue paying that interest for 7 years in its entirety.
So just out curiosity, let's say that the nonprofit has only cash puts into the deal, and then it's going to develop the property, and so the loan would be backed by the property, I assume.
Mm-hmm.
But then the loan coming in at the top end, what would that be backed by?
It would have to be other assets. I mean, that's, or if you're working with, again, this is a lot of education that's kind of on our shoulders, on our new markets team at SunTrust, is to educate our banking partners throughout the organization on how it really looks from an internal perspective at SunTrust if we're both the lender and the investor. And so that helps us get comfortable with the fact that our lenders can't take that project that you're developing at the lower tier as direct collateral for their loan. But ultimately, because of the controls we have as an investor in these CDEs, which may or may not be our own CDEs, but we own a portion of through this structure, it gets them ultimately to the same place, in our opinion. And so that's kind of going back again to why, if you really do need hard debt, why it makes sense to work with an organization that can do both, play both roles of new markets investor and lender to the leverage lender.
But I think also, if I understood your question correctly, I think that loan can be backed by the project, right? By the project that the Kulik is coming into.
I have because effectively it's one loan, right? I mean, you look at the whole structure, like one loan, like Sears, got the Kulik loan, and then you got the loan at the top, but the loan, the Kulik loan is really the loan coming in from the top here with the equity.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So what they do is, in a simple structure, what it would be is the loan coming in from the top. The security interest for that loan is the loan to the investment fund. Mm-hmm. And then the lender to the investment fund, its security interest is the equity of the CDE. So it tracks through, but you get a break in it because of the equity investment. It's really good. The key is that it has a chance of the ownership of the investment fund. So if the whole thing did blow up, they could eventually come down through, but as indicated earlier, they have to wait 7 years, which is a scary part. But the way they would come through is by taking over the investment fund, which then allows them to control the CDE, which then means they control the CDE, then the CDE has the loan, and now they basically control the loan and the security interest of the loan.
Right.
So that's how they get down through it. But it's a lot of steps for them, and they've got to wait 7 years.
Right.
So I
Well, it's actually $3.5 million because the other $1.5 million is coming out of for costs that have been spent to date. So it's $3.5 million, and then the $3 million bank loan is actually intended to be paid off rather quickly to some of the points that have been made. So probably by the end of the 7 years, it's 100% their loan. But what's really happening is you've got very, very low interest rates here. I believe in this one the leverage loan's at 1% and those qualifications are at 1.077%. So they're paying the debt service correct. So we need them to sort of pay debt service. We can't have it be zero for a number of tax reasons. It flows back up and aside from some fees that do need to get paid to operate that sub-CDE, most of the money goes back to the nonprofit. So it really runs, in essence, in a circle and comes back to you.
Well, the 2.6 is forgiven, so that's essentially that's the new market tax credit fee. So that's forgiven. But the loan A is still made up of all of the different loans or
yeah.
that are against the nonprofit, including the $3.09 million that is essentially the loan for
The hard debt.
That's right. That's right. And the debt service on that is going to be around $250,000 a year after the first year. So that it still seems to me like the nonprofit is paying part of the debt service on money that they lost in investment.
Right, but they're paying it back to themselves. Because they're sitting in they're wearing two hats on this chart. They're the not-for-profit. They're also at the very bottom box at Qualic B. And in this case, it was either a separate 501c2 or a C3 that was set up. 2C. I wasn't going to say. I redacted everything, and you blew my cover. But in this one too, it may have been because we do want 1% on that leverage. In most cases, most of the debt service probably went to the bank. But once that loan's paid off, then it goes to the not-for-profit.
But there's also a balloon payment. We don't pay off in principal over 7 years. There's a balloon payment of $2.4, $2.5 million that has to be refinanced.
Okay, that's correct.
In part, the reason why you have interest is the original bank debt money coming in is at a higher interest rate. That's right. Yes. And so the way you owe that bank. So if you didn't have the whole complicated market structure, you owe 4% a year to that bank. So what's happening here is the blended interest rate they come up with is a quality debt. Even though, yes, you're paying interest on your money that you brought into the deal, what they've done is they've figured out, okay, how do we get to 4%? How do we have enough cash flow going up to pay the bank 4%? And the way you do it is you charge 1.077% on the entire quality amount, which included your couple $1 million. So it's the same interest you would have paid to the bank anyway. So that ends up being net neutral, leaving at the end of the day the ultimate benefit, which is these $2.4 million you got. So that's what's happening.
Yeah, I mean,
They're sometimes confusing.
it is, and to summarize it, when you pay on that quality debt, the money can only either go towards the fees at the subsidy, which are predetermined and which are pretty nominal in this transaction. It doesn't go to the investor, and then it comes up. It goes to the not-for-profit, and then the not-for-profit covers the debt service to the bank. Those are the only really three places it can go: subsidy, not-for-profit, or the bank, and they only owe the bank so much. In this case, I think the 4% exceeded the whatever comes up because there was some other things to deal with here. So the not-for-profit actually in this case is paying some of that bank interest out of its own pocket, and it's not being sourced from the Qualic B. Right.
We have another question over here.
Sorry, I didn't get it. You say that actually a non-profit that can't be capitalized the letter just as one from certain kind of tracking. So I'm not sure whether there are other non-profits who have to do a capital application. In our case, we use ongoing projects that were in reconstruction or construction, after reconstruction, to leverage the letter entity. So you have mentioned that no one here puts in a lot of effort, but in our case, we have to see that deal we did in December. 7 years of work was at least trying that the benefits that were going to like the 7.5, I think, was our last. So we, other than other non-profits like don't feel practical construction projects, we have to rely on capital campaigns. I think we are more suited with the leverage lender trust.
Yeah, and even in this one, there's $3.5 million in cash equity they're bringing to the table at closing, in theory, and then the $3 million is in part or potentially in the whole being paid off by a capital campaign over the 7 years. So they brought a lot of money, about a lot of equity into this transaction as well.
Really, 3.5.
Yeah, 3.5.
Leverage something else, additional cash, you are cash heavy, you have to leverage additional than the 3 million investment. For example, it's not enough to have an initial infusion of liquidity, right? That's what you're saying.
They didn't have, correct. They needed $6.7 million in cash to effectuate this transaction. By the time we closed it, they had about $3.6 million. They borrowed the other 3.1, and so at that nonprofit level, that's where they'll deal with that loan. Instead of having that national bank lend into the investment fund, they just lent right to the not-for-profit because it was meant to pay principal, which isn't, paying principal on a leveraged loan gets a little unwieldy in these transactions. It can be done, but it doesn't behoove the CEs to do that because it bumps interest rates and diminishes their sort of reporting to the CDFI fund. So there's lots that you can do a whole transaction at that not-for-profit alone. Just, you can do 20 pages of modeling trying to show all the money's coming in and out at the different times. There's lots and lots of ways to do it. I mean, it's anything from we have no cash at closing, we borrow it all, to we have the whole $6.7 million. Okay. Okay.
There's one more point on this, and I don't recall if we covered this at a later time. I just want to draw your attention to those reimbursable costs. We do? Okay.
We do have a second on that later. So.
All right.
Dick, I'm reminded we're very close to the end of time.
Yeah. So we can, I think we can go through some of the next two slides are really about the credits. We've talked about the 39%. It's 5% a year for 3 years and then 6% for the next 4 years. So that's why you get 86 cents. They don't get 39% day one. They get it over time. There's time value of money. And the only other note here is that a lot of deals close at the end of the year because if you close on December 31st, you get your 5%. If you close on January 1st, you get your 5%. So folks are encouraged to get something closed at the end of the year, a very busy time of year for the industry. This just shows you the 5% and the 6%. So again, 10 million, 39% is 3.9 million, and you can see that over the 7 years on the bottom right. So we've talked a little bit about the benefits in terms of the net benefit, but during the 7 years there are benefits. This is non-conventional, non-conforming financing. It will have, you saw in the last slide, 1.077% interest. Now, that was self-leveraged, so part of that is the fact that it was self-leveraged. But Khalil, you want to talk a little bit about some of the benefits here in terms of the loan itself?
Yeah, so this is community development lending, and I think one of the very definitions of community development lending is favorable terms to a borrower. So how do you create favorable terms for a borrower? You lower the interest rate, you extend the interest-only period, you extend the amortization period to make the cost of funds cheaper, spread out. And New Markets does this through what we were talking about a little earlier, blending those different sources of financing such that we can render a lower interest rate. So if you have a project that you need a $10 million loan on, right? If you go to a traditional banking institution, you have to pay 4 to 6% on that $10 million loan. Well, that project may not qualify, or your cash flow may not qualify, or collateral may not qualify for a $10 million traditional loan. So when we bring the equity in as leverage, we've essentially lowered your loan to value, right? Which is another, which is a favorable market term in this transaction. We can lower your interest rate because we've now blended that equity with the traditional debt. So instead of paying 4 to 6%, you might be paying 2 to 3%, right? We have, in many instances, because we are a CDE who's acting as the lender, so we're taking two different sources of financing that is not really our own. In order to deliver this benefit to you from the fund, we have some flexibility that a traditional bank wouldn't necessarily extend. So we might allow a lower debt service coverage ratio on our loan to you than the traditional banking institution would. Most of the CDE loans come into the transaction without traditional origination fees. Now, there are fees we don't really characterize as origination fees, but you're not going to pay a 1 or 2% charge, if you will, just for me to extend you the loan. So these are some of the better rates and terms that a New Markets loan will provide to you that a traditional loan will not. And, of course, that B note, which gets effectively forgiven at the end of the 7-year period, comes into the transaction as subordinate debt. So you might have a situation where, because of the flexibility that we're able to offer, you might have a senior loan with another banking institution. If your New Markets loan comes into that transaction, and let's say there's a traditional loan on that same project, we might be more willing to subordinate our loan depending upon who's at the top of that leverage structure. We might have the ability to come in as subordinate debt to, let's say, SunTrust's senior loan, which you wouldn't necessarily get always with just traditional financing. They're either going to say, we need a new piece of collateral, or just tell you flat out, we can't finance that unless we're the senior lender.
So definitely, also, if you compare it to, say, mezzanine debt, because they really can't get there, it's sort of an even bigger sort of gap or advantage. So next, just talking about gap financing in the but for the program, but for this sort of subsidy, we really can't achieve our goals. I'm going to let Chris and Khalil talk a little bit about that. I think it's an important piece. Easier to meet in the nonprofit world for sure, but all nonetheless important.
Sure. So what we're starting to get into here with what we call the but-for test in the New Markets world is really kind of hitting on the three big things you need to, as a project, qualify for in order to really attract a CDE. First is making sure you're in a correct geographic location, which we'll touch on those details later. Second is clearly community impacts, which we've discussed, in terms of quality job creations, services for low-income persons, which is really where most nonprofits are going to hit the mark. But the last piece that we have to look at as CDEs when we're selecting projects to finance is your need for subsidized financing. So every deal has to pass the but-for test, which just simply states, but for the New Markets subsidy, this transaction would not occur. And so we need to understand why that is. And with a nonprofit, like Dick alluded to, usually it's a pretty straightforward way to get there. It comes down to, we can't raise all the capital ourselves, so without new markets, this project's not going to happen for a couple more years, if at all. It may be that, hey, we've raised very nearly all the capital, but if we can get new markets, we can do even more as an organization. In other words, we can just plow that right back to our service and mission. And those are the two most common things I see with the nonprofit space. It is a much harder and more detailed analysis when we're working with a for-profit, though, because we really have to kind of get behind the curtains and understand, really for them, why doesn't this make sense if you do have a strong balance sheet or what have you. So that's where we really have to get more analytical with our potential borrowers to make sure that they're not just trying to get this benefit to make themselves richer, because that's not the point of the program. We want to make sure that they really need it in order to get their job done, and that it'll create positive impacts. But Khalil, welcome to that.
Well, I mean, that's essentially it in a nutshell. I would say just in terms of that more detailed analysis, I would go back to some of these better rates and terms that you're looking at in order to qualify for debt to finance your project. Traditional lender is going to require 75, 85% perhaps LTV. They might require 1.2 debt service coverage ratio, and the interest rate that they provide, your cash flow, you might struggle to meet that. But for new markets financing, that equity coming into your transaction to lower your interest rate, to lower your LTV, and to perhaps lower your debt service coverage ratio, your deal could not move forward. So you can tie it to, traditional bank speak if it qualifies under those particular measures, I think.
Great, thank you.
So does that mean that if you're a well-capitalized, nonprofit that just have come from the cash flow, then because this doesn't sound like that third?
Well, I think another thing that we look at, particularly for nonprofits, is again who you're servicing and who you're able to serve because of this financing. So you take, I'll take a school for instance, or a federally qualified health center. And this gets it kind of into the gray areas, but let's say you do as an organization, there's a possibility you could fundraise maybe I shouldn't say. There's a way that you could raise all the funds to get this project. I, as a CDE, would have to look at, okay, so the additional dollars that you put into creating this project, is that taken away from your ability to serve X number more people? So you see this clearly, like with charter schools. There are some charter schools out here that are able to and have raised all of their financing and do their project, and they qualify, to be able to pay with that traditional lender to build that project and obviously pay that project off. They will often come in after the project is built or close to completion for new markets as a form of takeout financing. And so you kind of have to look at that, or we look at it as, okay, our ability to reduce their debt service allows them to bring on 3 to 5 more teachers, right? Or
build out a couple classrooms.
Right, create more classrooms, create more seats. So
technology, whatever.
There's a community benefit perspective that we take into account as well.
It's really, you kind of look at it, does it go into your pocket or does it go into the community's pocket? If it's going into the community's pocket, then I think that's the intent.
What's the accountability structure from the projects that you are choosing to fund? Is it your relationship with the government that you are in fact allocating tax credits for their intended use, or how closely do I have to adhere to what allows you to be allocated credits in the first place, such that you are selecting one project versus another other than the feasibility of it going through?
So There's a couple. I'll try to approach it kind of at a high level and then drill down to a specific project, because I think you're asking a couple different questions here. So as CDEs, we're held to, financing the types of deals that we told the government we would in our application. So if we said another way, if we want to keep winning awards, we need to do what we've said. I think both City First and SunTrust, we've won a lot of awards. We've won 8 out of the 10 times we've applied and won over $500 million in allocation, which tells me that, and I can look because I've been there since day one, we've done what we've said we're going to do with our allocation over time. And so we're definitely held to that standard. If we didn't do what we did, and we've seen this happen, we're not going to win anymore. We can keep submitting applications all we want, but the government will realize that, hey, you said you were going to do, whatever, and you did X plus, then sorry, you're out. But then when we drill down to and I think your question may be relevant to really what are my responsibilities if I'm a borrower under the New Markets Program in terms of compliance reporting, is what every deal now in today's environment has is what's called a community benefits agreement that's part of the closing package. And that's going to be tailored to that specific deal, and it will spell out kind of the type of specific reporting that we, the CDEs, are going to expect on an annual basis, as well as it will contain the compliance certificates just saying we're still a qualified active community, qualified low-income active community business, or QualiFB. But, so if you're a nonprofit and you are, a charter school educating kids, it's common to see, well, how many teachers do you have working? And a lot of community benefits agreements today will get very granular on what kind of benefits do you provide. Like how many of those are full-time positions versus part-time? How many pay a living wage? Then you'll have the other side of the ledger, which will focus on, okay, how many kids were educated there over the last year? How many of those received free or reduced rate lunch, so that we can really kind of get more granular on how many children of low-income low-income parents are we serving? So those are the types of things that will be specifically tailored in that community benefits agreement. That'll come back to us as CDEs, and then we, in turn, have to report back to the government on an annual basis those exact community benefits for every deal we finance every year until the deal is actually exited. So that's kind of how it all works, broadly speaking.
I want to have one quick comment.
Sure.
And that's from the legal perspective. At the end of the day, there's risk shifting. If something goes wrong in the deal, you can probably look at the picture and imagine who bears the ultimate risk if some piece isn't lived up to. That's generally going to be you all, the nonprofit at the bottom of the food chain, to whom the compliance burdens have been shifted. If something goes wrong and the credits don't get realized, who's got to kind of make it whole? It's typically the borrower in some fashion because of the covenants they've signed. And not that I'm saying there's something you're going to do about this, other than make sure your board is aware of it, that you are locked in for 7 years, you can't prepay it, it doesn't have that type of flexibility. So those are sort of things just to be aware of, again, when you go to your board, that this is a little different than your traditional bank loan. It comes with a different risk parameters that, in this case, again, get shifted down to you all.
Okay, we're a little bit over on time, so we're going to go through this quick. Qualification, there are generally 2 hurdles to qualify at a very broad level as a qualifier. And number 1 is where you're located. We talked a little bit about that. You need to be in a low-income census tract or serve a targeted population, which is a whole other animal that we're not going to cover today. What qualifies as a low-income census tract is if you're in one where the poverty level is at least 20%, or the median family income is at or below 80% of the area median family income. So that's hurdle number 1. You can run maps. You can go to cohnresnick.com. If you can find your way through the new market tax credit, there's a mapping tool that you can use. Pop in your address, and it'll give you this data. The second hurdle is, I believe you guys are probably doing close to 100% of highly distressed. So highly distressed means that the criteria changes from 20% poverty to 30% poverty. The median family income needs to be at or below 60% instead of 80%. Or you need the unemployment rate needs to be 1.5 times in that census tract, or it's rural, in other words, non-metro, or again, it's the targeted populations. So it's you qualify first, or you meet one of these 5, or you meet 2 11 other different criteria, and we've given you an example of about half a dozen of those right here. So that's something that is a little bit of a gray area. There's not a website to go to for every single one of those. Typically, I think you guys are primarily looking at you're hitting one of those first two bullets.
Yeah, and I would tell you, as borrowers, don't feel like you have to figure all this out. Like, that's what me and Khalil are here for. Like, reach out to me, let me know what your project address is. I'll help you figure out if at least you kind of hit one of these highly distressed criteria. That's just part of my day job, if you will. But yes, we've deployed 100% of our allocation over the time, and we commit to the government that we're going to put 100% of it in high distress communities versus just minimally qualified communities.
Okay. So then the last topic, really, before we move on to the next panel, is some of the criteria for maintaining qualification. There's sort of 5 things here. We'll do this very quickly. 50% or more of your total gross income is from an active conduct of a qualified business in a low-income community. You can swap that out with a higher tangible property because it's easier to do that. So the threshold for tangible property is 40% or more of your tangible property is located in a low-income community. It's 50% if you just want to cover that gross income criteria, which is down in these exceptions. And then the third one is services. 40% or more of your services are provided by the business employees or performed in a low-income community. If you have no employees, which really wouldn't apply here, you can also satisfy that with an 85% threshold on the tangible property. These are all and, by the way. You need to meet all 5 of these. And then the last 2, I believe this is the last slide before we got to the diagrams. Less than 5% of your average aggregate unadjusted basis of the property is attributable to collectibles. We don't run into this very often, other than we were talking a little bit about we have done museums and other things like that, but there's ways around that. And then the last one is non-qualified financial property. So if you have a foundation that's part of your not-for-profit, they would not be a good candidate for this because they hold stocks and bonds probably, and that would be a violation. They would be better suited to be like the leverage lender or sit in another seat at the table. And then the last thing are the ineligible business activities. I don't think any of this applies here. The first one is, except for possibly residential rental property, you can't do residential rental. So you look at that on a building-by-building basis, and if more than 80% of your revenue is from residential, then the whole building's residential. If it's less than 80%, the whole building is commercial. You can do commercial, you cannot do residential. If you're doing rental, your tenants have to be qualified, so that goes to primarily these sin businesses. For the most part, that is in the last bullet. That farming doesn't apply here. So then the last bullet is what we call your sin businesses. That's an operation of a golf course, country club, massage parlor, hot tub facility, suntan facility, racetrack, gambling facility, or a liquor store where the primary business is to sell liquor for consumption off premises. I think I got that right. Is that conflicting with what anybody's doing here? I'm guessing not. Those are probably not. Yes?
Not, but where is private schools going? Are they eligible?
Sure.
They're eligible.
Absolutely.
We've done a few private schools, actually, that really serve exclusively low-income persons, low-income children, like Cristo Rey schools, for example, if y'all are familiar with that name by chance, and some other private schools that really don't charge tuition to low-income children. So they're totally doable.
So it still has to meet all the criteria to be private, not charter.
Right. It doesn't have to be a charter school. That's correct.
We've done lots of universities. It's I can't. I'm sorry. What? Harbor? Harvard? I have done Harvard University. Yes. Correct. Supercomputer. It was MIT, Harvard, Northeastern. It was a facility. It was basically a supercomputer.
Then how does that meet the low
It was the location of the facility was in a low-income census tract.
There's the ability to isolate within a given entity, not Harvard University proper.
Yeah, they were just
a legal entity that isolates the testing.
We can talk about that because we're really behind time. So we're going to move on to the second panel, and a lot of these same questions can pop up there.
Look at Mike Carpenter's back room was moderating. 10 minutes, Mike, and then regroup and go. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you much.
No, pretty cool. You got it.
Yeah, I
You see great.
It's 4 days now.
You can go an hour. I can go. Yeah. Question.
We probably can. Yeah. So we hadn't figured a way to actually do that, but we'll find it. Yeah. Yeah, you might address that as Secretary. How we can. Mike Carpenter. Thanks for coming. Hey, good. Okay.
It's a tough time of year right now,
Walter, would it be an accurate statement to say that we'll push those slides out to everybody from minimal? You guys doing a great job. Push the button. Red light means it's on. Push the button against the green light, which means it's on. So you're telling me it's exactly there. It's red. So if you push the button, it turns the whole on. Oh, I'm not going to incentivize it. I learned that a long time ago.
Oh, yeah, no, look, I think you guys are great. One of our partners is in the database for us. Normally when I
This is your question, right?
Yeah.
Where's your other page? Okay, we got this. Okay, good. Yeah. All right, I'll okay, good. Okay, good. Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
That one's kind of
yeah.
an answer, but
I think exactly. Somebody wanted to talk about it, so we'll make sure we get that one. And it's funny, I just wanted to make sure that this question was broad enough because someone asked me earlier a question that kind of goes to this, and we touched on it, so that'll be enough for me to remember to ask it. Good. Excellent. Well, good. I'm going to hit the button.
Sure.
My wife
I think this came together quite nicely.
I appreciate everybody's help making it happen.
Well, and what would be great is we can just increase people's knowledge of this, and it'll just kind of spill forward, create opportunities. You guys are class up. Very nice.
Yeah, I think at some point we can pick up the conversation whether it's worth repeating this in the Baltimore area or something like this.
Well, I think it is.
It's be a lot easier now that we've done it once.
Yeah.
In our Baltimore office, we've got a facility that's similar to this.
Yep. And the other thing is that we got something that we can dust off and tweak and replicate. You know, a lot of the foundation work's been done.
Added value.
Just got to mark the person, see if she can do the easy push out.
Yeah, I think I'll give him a 5-minute warning. Okay, everybody, we'll give you a 5-minute warning. So if you need to take a break, you probably need to make time for that right now.
I know you do. Is that going to... As far as I know.
We don't know. We don't own the building, I don't think. We're just a tenant.
Useful information so far? Pretty complicated.
It is very complicated. It's still not 100% for me. I'm an auditor, so I am the post-legal side of it. How do we deal with financial statements? How do we close it?
The only thing that we would ask is that clients don't wake up and say, you know what, I want to put new market tax credit next week. Like this.
No.
There's a long runway.
Planned out.
Yeah. Yeah. If there's anything we can do to help from information, just from this collective group.
Right. Are you working with Mary Center?
Maria? No. Maria is right over there.
Okay. Oh, that's
I work for
you. Okay. Are you working with Willie Bridges, the ARP?
I was on the periphery of that, yeah. Okay. That was a nice one.
Okay, yeah.
But we, SunTrust, did put all that together with phase 1 and phase 2.
Now they're on 3.
There you go. I mean, we're involved in that.
So we're just about to start the audit. We're meeting with the audit committee pretty soon. So this is the first year of phase 3.
Cool.
And now we have to figure out all the disclosures and all that.
Cool. If I could before we leave, if I could get your card.
Oh, yeah,
great.
yeah,
I'll follow up.
absolutely.
I have mine back there.
We're starting to see a lot more of this stuff happening around town, and again, it's very kind of an interesting transaction for a not-for-profit.
Oh, it is.
Fantastic transaction. Incredible.
A lot of upside.
Yeah, a lot of upside. Do you see a lot of, and I know earlier there was a conversation about this not for individuals, but for investors. So, do you see LLCs and having a lot of big money people coming in on that kind of thing?
Well, in a way, the ARC was kind of like that, wasn't it? Where you had these different entities come in.
It's a nonprofit, so, but I'm talking about like, that want to create some sort of situation where.
I don't want to stop you from anything. I just wanted to say hi and introduce you to John Camp.
Okay, yeah, I think your card. I do have some friends that might be interested.
Cool. Thank you. We'll get started in 2 minutes. Just going like you want.
I learned a lot. Thank you so much. It's great. Hey, nice to meet you. Not what I had. I heard you do a good job.
Everything all right? No. You getting close? That's good. That's good. Oh, my gosh. Emails. That's just that work this week now. Of course, that didn't happen, right? That's funny. I had to do my one yeah, good for all. Well, it is for you, then. But it's all strange. Well, I think we're ready. Okay. I was even teasing I called. Khalil? If you have to answer this question in case I can ask it tomorrow, because I didn't know what time to prepare for my presentation. Yeah, you can. Are we late? Oh, we're leaving these all right. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think it probably makes sense to leave that one. Mike's actually he's going to lead and ask a question, and I just sort of put names based on what I kind of thought would be. Yeah, that'd be great. Sure. Let's learn about this. Oh, it does. Well, obviously, anyone could have.
Yeah, no doubt.
In, but
I've been
some of these things we've sort of touched on. Yeah, but you know, we can hit different points of. But it's fun. Was that it got interactive, so I think that's good.
Okay, well, we'll get started on the next panel. Thank you, everybody, for coming. A couple of editorial comments as we get started, or admin comments, is that if you would like to get a copy of the slides sent to you, if you would please come up and just, at the end of the program, just print your name out on this up here and give your email address, and we'll make sure you get that. For the SunTrust folks, I'll make sure that you get taken care of on that. All right. Also, if you have a question, if you would, I'll try to encourage you as this pops up from time to time, is come up to the microphone so that everybody can hear the question, because sometimes we lose that a little bit. But again, welcome. I'm getting this thought process of maybe being a game host person up here, but I won't go down that road, guys. Pretty much the current status of the program, there were a couple things that we wanted to make sure that we touched upon.
we've covered that a lot, so I'll move on to another area. One of those would be for the panel. How would you recommend that a sponsor seek new markets? Hire a consultant, seek to engage directly with CDEs or investors? What's the best way that you think, Chris?
Sure. So this is a question we get pretty often, and frankly, what a lot of CDEs want to see these days is that a qualification does retain a new markets consultant in order to really help drive the project to conclusion. And that consultant it is an added cost, yes, but most of these consultants that are in the industry are only paid upon successful closing of a new markets tax credit deal. So in other words, if they don't find you allocation for whatever reason, you're not out anything but your time, which is of course valuable as well. But to build off that though, we at SunTrust play the role of kind of an advisor also in terms of talking with our clients and prospects who have projects and kind of helping them through the process, and also helping them just kind of being very honest with them. If they have a project that's just we don't see as a very marketable deal in the new market space for whatever reason, we're going to tell you that, because it's, the market continually changes with what's kind of the hot thing to do in the new market space. Khalil and I both have talked about what those are. And while you can theoretically finance quite a myriad of asset classes in the new market space, there are certainly asset classes that are more difficult than others to do. And a couple examples of those, that don't really affect you guys as nonprofit sponsors are like, hotels can be really tough in the market. Museums, those sorts of facilities are not as competitive in terms of finding new markets allocation today as compared to projects that create either a high number of good quality jobs or provide direct community services to low-income persons. So the moral of the story, I know I went in a couple different directions, but the moral of the story is we definitely recommend, and I want Khalil's feedback on this too, we definitely recommend consultants be involved with the qualifies to kind of help walk you through it if you've never done new markets before. Because for us as a CDE and an investor, we can't fairly play the role of your kind of consultant as well as the entity that's analyzing the financing opportunity.
Is that the question?
The question is basically, do you as a qualified, do you advise? What's your advice for getting a consultant or a consultant versus not?
So I think that just depends on the level of experience that the developer or the borrower has. As Chris said, if you've never done a new markets transaction, definitely hire a consultant to kind of navigate you through that process. Particularly if you've never done any type of real estate development. We found that, I was just working with a borrower last year that had never done a new markets transaction, but they had a great deal of real estate development experience, and they were just excellent to work with. Didn't use a new markets consultant per se to get through the closing process, because they were just that familiar with real estate development and real estate development finance, that the few adaptations they had to make with new markets was really they just kind of relied on their attorneys to get them through that process. But if you don't have development experience, definitely hire a consultant. Or even if you do, in this particular transaction, it's just way more complex. A much larger transaction than you've ever worked on. I think could be helpful to have a consultant on hand.
Yeah, the one thing I'd mention in that, and I agree with everything Khalil and Chris have said, is to think about your own bandwidth. This is, if you're doing some development project, it's potential or maybe even likely that this is not what you do on a day-to-day basis. And if suddenly you or other folks with your organization have to be focused on this, they can take time, a couple of months to do the transaction. Having somebody whose job is to handle that for you may take a lot of pressure off, and more importantly, allow you to continue to be focused on what your organization is doing on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, kind of along those lines, when we talk about how to seek the credits, what do you, Khalil and Chris, what do you see as kind of maybe the best practices as far as a process for a sponsor to apply to you for the credits?
So for me, I prefer two things: a cut sheet. Like if you have a project and you've thought through the project, develop a project summary that tells what the project is, how much the project costs. Give me your projected sources and uses, and give me a good synopsis of what your community benefit how this project will benefit the community, and a synopsis of the development team. And that will give me a good idea of whether or not I would be interested in pursuing. Sending that via email or giving me a call is fine. Typically, a lot of times I'll get calls from folks looking to get their project financed, and they're telling me about a project in Connecticut. Well, we don't service, our footprint is not in Connecticut. We don't have that as a service area. So if you're pitching CDEs directly, you might want to take some time to kind of research their CDE to see what their service area is, what their footprint is. Or if you want to call them directly to get that information, that's fine. But, in order to make the process efficient for you, have an idea, if you're pitching CDEs directly, have an idea of what that CDE does, the types of projects they do, what their service area is, and develop a summary sheet that you can forward to that contact person so they can determine if this is a project that they want to move further, with you on.
And that's often something that, going back to the first question, that's often something that a consultant can help you walk through if you don't have, the ability to do that in-house or not. And that consultant can also help work with you and your board to educate them on what new markets are and how that works, because that's often a key component from a behind-the-scenes perspective for the nonprofit sponsor to get through. But I agree with what Khalil says completely.
And once we've decided, let's say we do decide that this is a project that really fits our sweet spot, and we're comfortable with the synopsis, we'll typically make a call requesting more information, and so that's when you want to provide a more detailed synopsis or more detailed summary, really digging into what your cut sheet showed us. And I, as well as most CDEs, will send you some intake forms. So we'll ask you to fill out a community impact survey that drills down to a granular level, in some instances, what the impact on the community is. We might send you a project readiness form so you can tell us where you are in terms of your construction drawings, your financing, just to get an idea of how shovel-ready you are to close. And more detailed information on your just really basic underwriting requests, your financials, bios on your leadership. These are things that we'll request you will use to underwrite the project initially to make a determination if we're going to move forward. And you want to be as detailed, I think, as possible, particularly on community impact and project readiness, because you'll hear in the industry that a lot of, CDs are really looking for shovel-ready projects, right? But if you have a really strong community impact analysis that allows the reader to really understand and know what the community benefit is and really be attracted by it, if you have a project that's not going to close until fourth quarter or maybe even first quarter next year, it's a possibility we might hold allocation out for that. So you don't necessarily have to be shovel-ready if your impact is good and you've been able to communicate that impact, particularly in that summary. If you have not really communicated the impact well in the summary or your project readiness in the summary, there's a possibility that I might not call to get more information from you, right? So if you have a project that's not going to be ready till fourth quarter and you haven't communicated the great community benefits of that project, I may not think to contact you to really delve deeper to know that this is a project that maybe I should hold out allocation for. So you want to be as detailed as possible to let the person you're contacting know really what the attractive features of your project are. You could be surprised in terms of how long someone might hold some allocation for you. Or if your project is not super impactful, but you're ready to go, right, that might also be attractive to me. because I might be looking for a transaction that is a good transaction, but really I'm more so looking for a project that's ready to close. So you want to be as detailed as possible on both of those fronts.
One minor thing that I'll note, really off of a point Khalil made, is if you go to the CDFI Fund's website, they provide a list of all CDEs, where they're based out of, where their footprint that they refer to, the footprint being the area in which the CDFI Fund has granted them access to do deals. Some CDEs have a very small footprint of a city. Some have a national footprint, but that'll be helpful. And you can also get information, frankly, as to when a lot of those CDs recently received allocation, so you have a sense of at least what they may have recently been sitting on. So that information is all publicly available at the CDFI Fund's website.
Just as a follow-up, when you think about best practices and applying for a new markets tax credit, how far out should they plan to get the project going as far as arranging for the financing? 60 days? What's a good thumbnail sketch?
I would start, if I'm understanding your question correctly, if you have a project that you're looking for new markets financing for, I would start as like a year ahead of time. Shopping it. There are several conferences, probably one in your area, but if not, there are several conferences that go on all across the country that bring investors and CDEs and borrowers together, resident codes, at least one annually, in one of the greatest cities in the country, Miami. Right.
May 16th through 18th.
Right. Yeah. And that attracts a good number of players in this industry. So that's a great place to go to meet who you need to meet, and they have wonderful workshops. They have this type of New Markets 101 training class that you can go to, and different breakout sessions and lunches and dinners where you can just kind of meet the people that are in this industry. So that's a great, I would start that shopping process as early as possible because it allows you to get on someone's radar, but it also allows you to learn more about this industry and what's needed so that you can kind of tweak your project and presentation to become, to be more attractive by the time awards are announced.
Yeah, I'll just add on, it's never too early. As long as you have kind of a vision for what your project might be, even if it's a few years down the road, it's still worth a conversation at a high level just to make sure that you're, eligible for new markets, broadly speaking, so as to not waste your time on it. If we find out there's some obvious reason why it wouldn't work for your deal or organization. But, we've had deals that have taken 3 years to close. I mean, by definition, a new markets transaction is one that cannot be done with just conventional means. So that means it's going to go through quite the roller coaster. We've had deals die, come back to life, die again, come back to life, and finally get closed. I mean, it's an interesting world we live in. So the moral of the story is, like Khalil said, start early.
Yeah, and one thing to think about, one thing we didn't touch on earlier today is how long does the deal take? Even from the point that we've got all the players together, it's probably 3 months from the time you have the first closing call to really get all the paper together because, as you can imagine from looking at the picture behind me, there's a lot of documents that have to do this. And in addition to these documents, there's underlying real estate diligence and other things. So just putting the deal itself together documentation takes a few months. Yep. So you really have to go far back. Mm-hmm. The other point that I would make is you heard reference earlier to the NOAA, the Notice of Allocation Availability, which is noted as we're expecting to come out, any time from, while we're sitting here to somewhere in April. And as indicated, the folks like Khalil and Chris are going to have to do their next applications. And one of the things they want to do in their next applications is tell stories of good deals that are in their pipeline. Mm-hmm. So if you're someone with a deal, even relatively early, you might be able to convince Khalil or Chris or some other CDE, hey, talk about my deal because it's got great community impacts, and effectively get yourself a foot in the door even before they've gotten the credits.
Okay, let's check in with the audience. Does anybody have a question? Please step up to the microphone. Thank you so much. So everybody can hear you.
Whatever you're moved to do.
Just in terms of the paperwork and trying to get the deal closed, who usually, coordinates that or sort of? who usually quarterbacks that process?
Sure. So what you have is you end up with 3 sets of lawyers in a simple transaction like this. The lawyer for the borrower, qualification, the lawyer for the CDE, and then the lawyer for the investor. In a typical transaction, the investor's lawyer, along with the investor, really quarterback the whole transaction. They're the ones that keep things moving. Another critical role is Dick and the accounting firm who are modeling the transaction. And so what you'll get is, a 65-page, highly detailed financial model that Dick will do that shows how all the funds are flowing through the entire, not only through the compliance period of the 7 years, but typically the loans that are provided in these deals are structured as though they were 30-year loans or longer. And so it's modeled out throughout that to show that, in fact, that the borrower can pay the debt service.
There's a part 2. Well, really, it's not a part 2. It's just a second question. I'm just looking for any kind of best practices for how to reduce the cost of the overall transaction, both going in as well as the unwind. Is there any? And this goes for folks who have done these transactions before out in the audience. But are there any best practices, stuff that you could do on the front end to kind of make sure the costs during the front end as well as the unwind are kind of suppressed?
I mean, the most obvious one to me, and I think this chart is a good example of it, is try to keep the number of allocations to the number of entities you're working with to a minimum, because every time you add another entity, you're adding another set of eyes, another attorney, no offense. But that's, adding into the cost. So unfortunately, most CDEs tend to not write gigantically huge checks for allocation. So if you have a $20, $25 million, $30 million deal, you're going to be faced with working with at least a couple CDEs, if not maybe even 3. So I think that's the biggest way to suppress costs, is to keep the number of parties down. That's pretty obvious. Beyond that, I think it's just keeping everyone on task through the closing process and making sure, and that's one thing we take very seriously as the investor, is we make sure that our counsel that represents us have the correct personalities to really drive those closings and hold everyone else accountable for their responsibilities through the closing, to make sure that we don't have conversations that languish and deals that just don't get closed for no good reason quickly.
The selection of the borrower selection of a really good attorney is critical, because you want as much as possible to go through any potential issues with your attorney before you get everyone else's attorney on the call, so that you work out your structure as much as possible, kind of mitigate any or reduce as much as possible any back and forth negotiation or hiccups that once everyone's attorneys get on the call, it's like, oh, we can't do this. So now you got 3 sets of attorneys trying to figure out something that really, one, your attorney, who's probably going to be the least expensive, perhaps, could have figured out before it came to, the attention of everyone.
Yeah. That's a huge point. If you're the borrower, you may have a relationship with your counsel that you've worked with for years, but if they don't have new markets experience, it's not the right role for them, because it's just going to cost you a ton of money to educate them via all the other attorneys in the deal. So, we highly recommend that the borrower reach out to a firm that has new markets experience and work directly with that partner or partners that have closed new markets deals and represented qualities.
Yeah, well, the one other thing that I would add to that, which I think is really a takeoff of both of their points, is make sure your project is really ready and that you've got all of the diligence for the project. Because one of the things that I've seen delay things is, you suddenly are already in the closing process, all of these new market documents are floating back and forth, negotiations happening, and then we find out that there's still early stage permitting problems that haven't happened, for example, in a construction project. Well, next thing you know, you have everybody have to put everything down, wait a month or 2. Well, I don't know about anyone else's memory in the room. 2 months later, I may as well be starting a new deal, because it takes time to get everything back up to speed. So being honest with yourself of, are we really ready to do this deal now, I think is helpful as well.
Great. Hi, thank you. I had two questions. The first one was, is it true that new market tax credit should be for new construction, or can it also be for rehabilitating, significant renovation?
I would say both. I mean, there's no question. I mean, quite frankly, you could even, just in terms of rehabilitation, this is another transaction that was twinned with the historic credits, which is historic rehabilitation. So there's nothing that as a matter of fact, I would say majority of the deals are purchasing some, like for instance, a charter school might be purchasing an old school, and then it's going to be majorly rehabbed to then house a new location for the charter school.
Great, thank you.
But in terms of rehabilitation, you have to meet a threshold of 25%, what they call 25% substantial improvement of the adjusted basis of the.
Yes, that's an allocation agreement requirement for the CDEs. So there's sort of two levels of requirement. You got to meet the IRS requirements and then the CDFI requirements. These guys have allocation agreements with the CDFI fund, and that's one of the issues. It's pretty easy to meet on a building-by-building basis. So if your basis in the building is $1 million, you just have to do $250,000 of rehab.
Yeah, the takeaway is, said another way, you can't just use new markets for refinancing permanent debt. That's prohibited use of capital.
And then the other question is more for us beginners. So as we look out at the landscape of types of funding, what are the biggest pros and cons of new market tax credits versus other types of funding that we could obtain? And, what is the sweet spot for what would be a really good candidate for new market tax credits beyond the purposes that you've done a really good job outlining?
That's a tough question to answer succinctly without a lot of specifics behind it. But we do go through that analysis, especially with our not-for-profit clients that may have access to tax-exempt bond financing, for example. So we'll want to work through that with kind of really three of us on the line, me, you, and then our local nonprofit team to make sure that we're all kind of looking at the same opportunity here and figure out what pencils out and what doesn't. What gets the deal done for you, what doesn't. And the question on the new market side is, a lot of times we'll see deals that work with tax-exempt financing and new markets. And the question is does new markets allow you to do something more with your project than just that bond financing might? Mm-hmm. And if that answer is yes, then it's worth kind of continuing the dual path search for both of those options. If the answer is no, it gets us to the same place, and you know what, taxes and bonds work just fine. Mm-hmm. I'll typically give the advice of, well, you know what, new markets is far more complicated. It's going to take a lot more time and expense to close, more than likely. If taxes and bond financing is going to get you where you need to be, go do it. That's not as finite of a resource as new markets tax credits is just nationally. But that's the analysis we tend to go through. See what other, look at all the different levers that you have to pull and see where they'll land you organizationally.
Okay, great. Thanks.
And then also, just a quick point, in terms of new markets, in terms of sweet spot and the size of the deal, you typically don't want to do anything less than $5 million. Yeah.
Yep. Great. Marking off questions. Yes, sir.
Do any of you know whether a new market tax credit transaction has been tripped up by local regs? For example, we have, I'm paraphrasing here, a DC regulation that says if you are a beneficiary of IZ subsidized land, you cannot use any additional local or federal subsidies in that project. So from a due diligence perspective, who determines whether a project can go forward with such kind of local caveats?
I have seen this before. We've dealt with a couple groups that, because they're technically kind of governmental entities or they're considered municipalities, specifically the one I'm thinking about is the hospital. They are prohibited from borrowing certain types of debt that have, terms over X years or lack amortization or whatnot. And so what we advise and what they ultimately had to do is go talk to their local counsel that understands those local regs and have them do the analysis, and while looking at the new market structure to figure out if that's something that we can figure out a way to work. So really I kind of throw it back to the Mike Schiffers of the world to help us or help you really go through that analysis.
Yeah, and the thing is, one of the things that's nice about the new market program is it's pretty flexible. It doesn't limit you generally in taking advantage of other subsidies, unless the structuring of that subsidy comes into conflict with the structure we have to do here. And that's something that the new markets consultants, that's something that the lawyers can help with in trying to say, yes, this project could take advantage. I think Dick mentioned a few minutes ago that maybe this project had historic tax credits in it too. So you can combine different subsidies, and there's usually not a limit. It's not by taking on the new market, you're not necessarily limited from taking advantage of other subsidies. And then you can get very complicated transactions where you bifurcate portions of the project if it's large enough to take advantage of different tax credits. Khalil and I was representing a different CDE, but Khalil was involved in the deal too, where they condoed off 5 different pieces of a very large development project. One piece was new markets, one piece was LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. So, there was ways of being creative, and the lawyers and new market consultants can help you with that.
So, but then we'll rely on the tax opinion of the investor, not of the local authorities, because it's the investors' dollars that are at risk, right?
I'm not sure I'm following your question.
For example, do we get an opinion from the District Department of Housing and Community Development that these DC regs do not apply to this particular project, or do we depend on the investor's final tax opinion that we are fine and that the investment is not at risk?
Yeah, what you would have there is it could be any number of things depending on what type of issues you're concerned with. The most basic level will be is that your own lawyers will help confirm for you and confirm to you that this is fine. The secondary level is at times, particularly if there's other financing involved from other government-affiliated financing programs, is you usually do have to get some level of sign-off from them. I wouldn't refer to it as an official opinion or anything like that, but you'll get some level of approval to set up your structuring where you'll actually explain to them, here's the deal we're doing. Does this interfere with the fact that the parent entity had gotten some bonds from the city before? So sometimes you have to do it that way. And obviously one of the nice safety nets, while isn't necessarily for you to rely on, is the disadvantage of more lawyers is more money. The advantage of more lawyers is you've got more people being thoughtful about it. So if you've got a complicated situation like you're suggesting, not only is your counsel going to be thinking about it, you can be sure that the CDE's counsel is going to be looking at it, making sure that it doesn't create a problem. And then on top of that, you can be sure that the investor's counsel is going to be considering it. So you could feel pretty safe that someone's going to do their job and make sure it's okay.
Thank you. Sure. All right. Well, we'll get back on some of the other topics that we wanted to make sure that we address. You've gotten a current status of the programs and some general knowledge about how to seek credits for your project. Let's just talk for a moment just about evaluating deals. And if I could, I'll steer this one over to Mike and Dick. What are highly distressed criteria, and why are they important?
Yeah, sure. And you'll recall Dick showed you this slide earlier. As we talked about, the key is that the business has to be in a low-income community. And as Dick outlined earlier, that's poverty at 20% at least, or median family income at or below 80% of the area median family income. But that's really not the end of the story, because while that's a technical program requirement, if we go to the next slide, and as Dick indicated earlier, most CDEs want deals that are in highly distressed communities, which have these additional distress criteria. And why do they want that? One is, frankly, it tells a better story when they're telling about the deals they've done. More likely is that many CDEs have promised to the CDFI fund that some high percentage, 90%, maybe 100% of their deals will be in highly distressed communities. So this is sort of a reminder to you as you're thinking about whether your project's eligible, is to also think about whether it satisfies these additional distress criteria. And I think, as Dick mentioned, and I'll give a plug for them, they've got a great mapping tool on their website that will help you sort of find some of this information out at the ConResnick website.
Yeah, so one of the things that I get, because people do go to our website and then we get a call, and they're trying to fit into these, so it says other options as defined in Section 3.2H of the allocation agreement, CDE allocation agreements. And they're trying to fit into these two. They don't qualify on number one. If you can't qualify on this page, it's it. You don't go to the next page and then say, you can't not qualify and then be highly distressed. So it's a confusion, and you don't hear people talk about it a lot. It's supposed to be intuitive, but I don't know that it is that intuitive. So obviously the first two bullets here, if you're at 30 or the 60, then you qualify automatically here. But then people go to these other, like, well, I'm non-metro, so I qualify, right? No, because you don't meet the base IRS. This is IRS. This is CDFI fund. Any questions on that?
Okay. I'll just follow up with you on this one, Dick. What are some of the hot new market tax credit deals that you're seeing right now?
What we see that people like, and then I'm going to kick it over to Chris because he probably sees quite a bit too. I think people like community centers that provide a broad array of benefits to a community that's in need, whether that's job training or a myriad of other things. Rural manufacturing, I'm seeing a lot of that. Historically, healthcare and charter schools have always been popular and still are, and then kind of like these makerspace transactions are pretty popular as well. Chris, I'll let you.
Another one is healthy foods. So there's a lot of CDEs whose strategy is to deploy their capital to areas that lack traditional grocery stores and healthy food options. So those types of projects, especially if they're located in a food desert, are very attractive to CDEs these days. Everything else Dick mentioned, I think, is absolutely accurate. As I mentioned earlier, there's a few asset classes that aren't quite as exciting. Generic office space might not be as exciting. I think it depends who the tenant is. And, again, we're going to want to drill down as a CDE to understand what kind of jobs are you creating. Are you creating job opportunities for low-income persons that allow them to advance? Or are you just creating, part-time jobs that don't really go anywhere and don't really have any benefits? That's not very exciting. So another option is if you have an office building that's going to be full of, very high-paid professionals, that's also not a good use for new markets tax credits. That's not generating the type of impacts that would positively impact the lives of low-income people. But to build on this, one thing you will find when you start looking at like the CDFI's website, if you go and start reading about, the various CDs that are on there, all of us have little blurbs that speak to what our business strategy is. And so usually we're limited to like just a few sentences. But you can usually quickly tell at least what types of deals those CDs want to do. Because there's CDs out there that want to do nothing but rural manufacturing. There are CDs that want to do nothing but healthcare facilities. And then there's CDs that are more like City First and SunTrust, who look at a broader array of asset classes. So when you start down that path, if you're going to start picking up the phone or shooting emails of, your project summaries to folks, take a read at that business strategy, because you might be, wasting your time and someone else's time if you're a nonprofit and all they say they want to do is, rural for-profit manufacturing facilities. Just a word of advice.
Okay, let's go in a different direction. Let's just assume that you've got a new markets tax credit eligible project. What would be some negative factors that would dissuade you from wanting to get involved with that project. Khalil, you mind taking that one on?
So negative factors is relative. Like Chris said, my focus would deter me is if the deal did not really meet my focus as a CDE. But it doesn't necessarily mean that would deter another CDE whose focus you are meeting. So that's one thing. Two, as Chris just said, jobs, obviously very important, but there's a balancing act between a project that might create a lot of high-paying professional jobs, a project in a low-income census tract, and you'll see, for-profit developers submit their projects for NMTC consideration because they're in a low-income census tract. However, the jobs that will be created from that project are really going to non-low-income persons, right? So that, at face value, is a deterrent. But, sometimes we might look deeper and see, okay, how distressed is this community? Because another one of the benefits or the purposes of new markets is to have a catalytic economic development effect on a community. And you don't always get that with a project, or so I'm going to say you're not limited to that effect just by doing projects that serve low-income persons. So if I can finance a project in a low-income census tract that I think might serve as a catalyst to bring other development to that area that would, in fact, be more of a direct benefit to low-income persons, I might be inclined to finance that project, particularly if there's no other interest, or if this project doesn't get funded, we interest in that community will wane significantly. So there's a balancing act with that. But those are the two, and then development team. If I see a development team that I know has no capacity or has had a history of failed projects and things like that, I will back away.
Okay. This issue popped up, and you wanted to talk about it, but we went on. And we talked about costs. It's very, very expensive as far as getting through the process. Can any of these incurred costs be reimbursed?
Yes. So this is a great question, a timely one, and one where, frankly, the industry is in a high degree of uncertainty, is what I would say. So it used to be that you could reimburse a developer's costs for previously incurred costs as part of the transaction and allow those costs to help facilitate what ended up being the leverage loan. Those costs could have included the acquisition of the land, any of the early development costs that they entered into, anything. And it really created a situation where you could do a structure where you could really sell existing land that was owned by a sponsor to the qualifications, effectively paying itself for its land, and then fund the transaction through it. And it was an efficient structure that helped. But over time, some aspects of that were being viewed as being inappropriate under the program. And so the CDFI fund released 3 frequently asked questions. While they were intended to provide guidance and help to folks in understanding what was appropriate for the program and reimbursement, these frequently asked questions have led to nothing but more frequently asked questions. And so where we stand today is that if your costs are more than 24 months out, they're not going to be able to be reimbursed. There's hope, I think, that at some point the CFI fund will make it clear that older costs could be reimbursed as long as those reimbursements aren't being used to fund the leverage loan, put differently, to be the equity that the sponsor's putting into the project. But as we sit here today, in all deals, what you'll have is now the loan documents will provide limits on what costs can be reimbursed. There will be very careful tracing of the costs that you've incurred to prove that they were incurred in connection with the project, to show that they were incurred within a 24-month period. And people are going to track that very carefully and take that very seriously. So that does create some risk for a project that's been going on for a long time, because you may not have as many reimbursable costs as you'd like. Otherwise, most costs that are directly to the project can, in fact, be reimbursed.
Yeah, I would just one thing I'd point out is just because you have costs that are over 24 months doesn't necessarily mean the transaction doesn't work. So in other words, if I've been in construction or I've done a lot of let's just call it pre-development, and I've got $3 million of costs, and $2 million of them are within the last 24 months. The $2 million can be essentially recycled or run in a circle and be used as leverage as long as they're properly documented, which is a requirement. The other $1 million can stay in the project. So in other words, if the sources and uses are such that there's $1 million or more of required equity to be at this qualified active low-income community business, that's okay that those costs are older. They can stay at the project. They just can't be reimbursed and then used as a source of leverage, or to Mike's point, I think that's what folks think that it's supposed to be, or just be reimbursed, period.
And so with that 24-month window, as a sponsor or developer, you want to be aware of that, particularly, with your closing timeline. Because you don't want to, if you have some really large expenses that you want to be reimbursed as used as leverage in the project, and there's an opportunity to get that included, you want to move at a pace where you don't get outside of that 24-month window, because I haven't seen many CDEs try to get that 24-month window waived. So once you get outside that 24-month window, a CDE is not going to be likely to even attempt to get a waiver to get those costs included as leverage in your transaction. So just be aware of the timing of where you are in the process.
It's an excellent point. I mean, I can think of a deal we're working on now, and literally every day that's going by is changing what can be reimbursed. And there's a little bit of cushion now, but this is one of those ones, if we can't get closing on time, it could create a serious problem.
Yeah, this transaction had a cushion, so it has almost $926,000 of equity. I think somewhere in the range of 600 or 700 of that was older than 24 months. So it had a little bit of a cushion, but you sort of had to keep shifting as every week went by. What are we identifying to be reimbursed? And stuff peels off, but we had that cushion.
Okay, let's check in with the audience. Is there any questions? Does anybody want to ask a question?
Honestly, this is a relatively newer development, and folks are navigating it. I think, my experience, people are being pretty conservative in navigating it. Now, as Dick said, I mean, there's still advantages to that equity and that value being there, so it doesn't preclude the transaction. But what it results in is a potential for a further gap in funding the transaction, and that's really the problem. And so, so folks are being, I think, very thoughtful. I mean, to your point, in terms of a workaround, I wouldn't really refer to it as a workaround so much as maybe people are being very thoughtful about what expenses might actually exist, or could exist, or need to exist, that are legitimate but incurred within the appropriate time frame, or will be incurred within a short period of time.
Anyone else? All right, maybe kind of along those lines is maybe some unique strategies. Is that have you ever seen other financial incentives that have been combined with new markets tax credits, maybe a state tax credit or tax exempt financing? And maybe if you have a story, that'd be great.
Yeah, so this deal had federal historic credits, federal new market credits, and state historic tax credits. So that's three credits that all work differently. And I guess sort of the challenge with some of that is, in this case and in a lot of these cases, we're trying to leverage the proceeds of these credits. So that was what I always tell people. We're trying to jam everything through a funnel. And when you do that, it puts a lot of pressure on the deal from a number of different ways. One of it is it typically all comes in as debt. So I have all these subsidies that are all being pushed through this funnel. They come through as gross debt to me, and I got to show that I can pay off all that debt. So that's sort of one of the challenges of it. I think some of the other challenges are just some of the cases and regulations, et cetera, that have come out that imply that you may be prohibited from doing certain things. So certain bank investors will allow historic credit dollars to flow through the new markets, and some won't. So that's part of the challenge. And then of course the state credits is all different issues. There's taxability issues that, depending on what state you're in and how the credit works, can come into play. I think we've seen some EB-5 loans be utilized in new markets. That's also sort of a different thing. It's a loan. It's typically 5 years. Is that what it is? So it's a little bit less than the program. So you kind of have to navigate through that. It's not the easiest thing to do. I think in theory it's a flexible program in the sense that you can utilize other credits other than LIHTC. You cannot pair it with LIHTC, other than Mike gave an example earlier where at different phases or sections of transaction that were basically, I assume they were condoed out, and they were just entirely separately owned and in separate entities. I think that the takeaway from all this is that they're really and by the way, there's a state loan in here. There's a not-for-profit loan. I mean, this has a ton of subsidies here that were all leveraged through this structure. And I think that's the big takeaway, is that it is a flexible program in that way. There's lots of complications, but it is flexible.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is in terms of one other thing you see is grants a lot of times, and the key is navigating whoever was the issuer, whether it's an issuer of a grant, whether it's some state bond, whatever it is also having to sometimes educate them about the program, because what ends up happening sometimes is that, for example, the sponsor of the project has already gotten whatever the other award is. But then, because we have to create the new market structure and we have to move the asset that's being developed, for example, into a separate entity, sometimes then you have to go back through the application process for whoever awarded the other tax subsidy to make it clear to them that that it's still the same person that has the subsidy, but it's just a new name. So there's just some complexities that can go into that.
And Chris and Khalil, you guys do a lot of deals. You see a lot of stuff out there. Is there any one, when you think about combining different incentives, is there any project that stands out in your mind?
Well, this one.
Okay.
Yeah, so
it's fun, right?
All right, this is a lot of fun. No, I mean, so we haven't done a lot of paired financing. We've done maybe it's like 4 or 5 twin. I don't even know if they're still calling it twin deals, historic new market tax credit transactions. We've done a couple, as Dick mentioned, the pairing it with LIHTC, so to speak, but you have to the part of the project that takes the LIHTC financing has to be legally separate from the part of the project that takes the new market tax credit financing. So it's very effective in mixed use projects for sure, where you have some housing that you want to provide at a below market rate, and a retail component that you want to deliver with some subsidy. The condo method where you're able to twin that LIHTC and new markets is very effective. And of course, historic and new market twinning delivers a good deal of subsidy to the borrower at the end of the day.
Okay. All right. Well, back out to the audience before we ask our last question. Does any audience member have a question? Okay, Chris, I'll go to you on this last one. Is that there's a lot of different terms and nomenclature that's out there. What's the importance and what is a non-metro transaction?
Sure. So may or may not be relevant to the group here today, but non-metro is its own kind of definition within the New Markets program, and there's a database available to the public where you can look and see what census tracts are considered non-metro or not. Non-metro is a really close synonym to rural, but it's not the exact same. There's a bunch of set-asides in the New Markets world that we as CDEs have to basically determine what percentage of our allocation do we want to set aside for, non-metro transactions, for example. And Khalil may not check that box at all, because he may serve, communities that don't include rural communities. We do. The bank, SunTrust Bank's footprint covers quite a bit of rural communities through the Southeast and Mid-Atlantic. So we've committed to the government to deploying 20% of our current allocation to transactions located within non-metro communities. So that's just, something to be aware of as you reach out to CDEs, that you may run into some CDEs that are actually considered non-metro CDEs, meaning that they deploy the vast majority, if not 100% of their allocation to rural transactions, and they may not have an interest in your project if it's in the District of Columbia, for example. So there's all these other small, we're just kind of scratching the surface today from that sort of detail. There's another, few boxes that we checked, like underserved states. There's 10 states as well as territories that have received the lowest amount of new markets allocation on a per capita basis across the country. And I'm not sharp enough to list all 10, but I can tell you the 3 that are at least in SunTrust footprint, which are Georgia, Tennessee, and Florida. And we've committed to deploy 40% of our allocation to those to underserved states. So when you start to talk to other CDEs, we have clients who, when you start stacking these requirements on top of one another, all of a sudden, 90% of their allocation has to go to some special bucket. So that just makes it more difficult in some instances for certain projects in certain states to locate allocation. And all this is kind of driven by the fact that the government wants to make sure that there are no communities kind of being left behind from a new markets perspective. And so they've incentivized all of us, through the competitive application process to consider, can we sharpen our pencils and really commit to deploying a real measurable amount of money to underserved states, to non-metro communities, and what have you.
Okay, last chance for the audience as we wrap this up. Any questions?
I would say it's possible.
Yeah, I will tell you that supercomputer I described earlier was like 4 different closings. They just kept adding allocation to it. So I think if you're going to expand and you're going to serve the low-income community different than you are now, and you were to approach CDEs, I absolutely think they'd be interested. There's no reason you can't do it. It's certainly been done plenty of times.
And also, in particular for schools. Yeah, I've seen that a couple of times in schools. Yeah.
And to the point, one of the things that I suspect that Khalil or Chris might find attractive is, hey, some borrower who's done a deal before is going to be a lot easier to do a second deal with. They understand the ins and outs. They've been there. So if they've got another compelling project or an expansion of a prior project, that may give you some advantage because people,
you've already got the documents that you can hopefully just update and replicate. So it will be a much more efficient transaction.
Well, what we were mentioning earlier is, so what Chris is alluding to is if the 3 together gets you to $8 million, then in general terms you'd say, okay, let's lump the 3 together. You need to sort of understand what they are, where they're located. You just want to sort of dot those I's and cross those T's. But there are folks committed, another carve-out, that the carve-outs that Chris was alluding to, small deal funds. So you'll see some folks out there that are really trying to almost, in a very efficient manner, using the same documents, sort of boilerplate, do like $2 million loans. There's not a ton of it, but it's certainly out there. So
we actually do that. So we set aside 10% of our allocation annually to where we deploy capital in the loan size between $500,000 and $2 million to specifically nonprofits and small businesses that ordinarily would never come across new markets in their daily course of business. So it's obviously, we won $80 million, so that means we're held to deploying at least $8 million that way. That's, 4 to 6 transactions to finance the exact type of project you're talking about. The difference is that these deals don't look like this, which is good, I think, because they're very straightforward. They're 7-year interest-only loans that have to be fully repaid, but we use the benefit of the tax credits to buy down the interest rate and waive all the origination fees. So it winds up being an extremely cheap transaction, but it doesn't have that kind of B-note gap financing aspect to it. So you're still going to have have the, a little bit of equity in the deal yourself, one way or another, in order to qualify for the financing as our lenders underwrite it. But it's been a great tool for SunTrust over the years, where we've really been able to do a lot of financing for businesses that ordinarily would just have no way to tap, a transaction like this, or in our industry.
And just to your combining point, to some degree, depending on what the projects are, and as Dick alluded to, sort of how they're connected and if they're near each other, because the more disparate they are, if there are 3 projects in 3 very different places, even if all low-income communities, it just sort of adds to the level of complexity for someone who's investing in the transaction to think through and say, okay, am I sure that my qualic B is going to be a qualic B, because now I've added risk because of the different businesses in different places.
You're saying a scattered site within the same census tract would be in the same asset class.
Certainly.
Yeah, that's more reasonable. I think that's closer down the fairway than not. I think the key for it, too, is making sure that they're all going to be on the same path for construction, because there's another element of new markets where we need the capital that we deploy spent by the project in 12 months. So, if you have 3 projects and one's ready to go, but the other 2 are, 6 or 8 months out, that's going to give the CDE a lot of consternation about, well, is my money really going to be spent in 12 months? Probably not. So that's going to hurt your ability to get new markets on those 3 projects together.
So scattered sites, you have all the permitting ready to go.
Yeah, exactly. Every one of those deals, and that's what adds the complexity for everybody, we're going to need to see that you guys are on a parallel path for all those projects from a construction and permitting perspective.
Okay, well, we've covered a lot of ground this morning, and if you would like to get a copy of the slides, if you would, just print your name and email address up here on the pad right here. Also, the panelists, if there's going to be a question you're going to think about probably a week or so from now or whenever, but they are available. You can just reach out to them, and we will hopefully be putting on an event like this from time to time. But we greatly appreciate you coming, and thank you to Venable for making their space available for this seminar, and we hope you guys have a great week.
Thank you.